Добрий ранок. Ми дуже вітаємо.
Good morning. We are happy to welcome you in Ukrainian Crisis Media Center. We have a special guest. We have Mr. Randy Barry, U.S. State Department's first ever special envoy for the human rights of LGBTI persons.
Mr. Barry, the floor is yours.
Well, let me say good morning, and I'd like to start out with a few comments before obviously being happy to take any questions that you might have. I might share that I've just had a wonderful morning walk through Kyiv on this great and beautiful morning through the Maidan. This is my first time in Ukraine, my first time in Kyiv or Ukraine, and it was a great opportunity for me to get a better sense of the sense of recent past here, and help me engage more effectively on behalf of my government. I thought I might begin with just a general statement of what the United States government is doing, what I am doing in the exercise of my role as Special Envoy for the human rights of LGBTI persons, and then talk more specifically about the nature of my mission here in Ukraine. So back in 2011, our Secretary of State at the time, Hillary Clinton, and our President, Barack Obama, for the first time signaled and directed America's foreign policy arms to begin to work on a new policy, and that is to take a look at the global human rights situation for members of the LGBTI community, and to do what we can do using the United States government's influence and contacts and programming to support a greater progression and a better understanding of the true nature of equality. Back in 2011, the President issued a presidential memorandum to that effect, and the Secretary of State delivered a set of remarks at the Human Rights Council in Geneva, which gave us the architecture and the foundation upon which our policy is currently built. And very simply put, that is an equational observation that, in fact, LGBTI rights are human rights. Human rights are LGBTI rights. It's the same foundational underpinning of our work on behalf of gender equality globally. Again, understanding that women's rights are human rights are women's rights. That really, at the end of the day, what we're talking about is how we can engage with governments, with civil society, with business, with others, to advance the notion and engage in a conversation about what it really means to have equality and dignity under the law, whether that's in America, whether that's in Ukraine, or any other country. So in the past, I was sworn into office back in February of 2015 and began work in April. And since that time, I've had the chance to travel to 43 countries around the world to have this very basic conversation. And I think that oftentimes there is a lot of misperception about what we're doing, or a presumption of how we're engaging that in fact isn't really born in reality. So let me explain that a bit to you. So in a global sense, when I travel, I put a key priority on obviously meeting with representatives in government, because I am a representative of the President and of the Secretary of State in the U.S., to engage in that conversation and to talk about what governments can do in terms of getting legislation and regulation correct and providing security for members of this community, not as a special area of focus, but merely on the same basis of equality that any other citizen in any country would naturally deserve. I also engage very significantly with members of civil society, because it's clear to me, given the path that we've had in the U.S. on these issues, that civil society, in fact, is ultimately what changes, has the capacity to change a nation, a society's understanding of the reality of these issues. I also engage with leaders in business. I engage with leaders of communities of faith where that's possible. And I enjoy a conversation, even though these might be difficult conversations, anywhere I can, because as I have traveled globally, I have found that there are some consistencies. One is that civil society is that which sees change through. It happened in my country, it happens in every country. I am also significantly hopeful. I've had the privilege in this past year of witnessing what is truly a global movement. And it's not a global movement because the United States wishes it to be, though we would. It is a reality. And while I think that there are certainly many negative strands to be concerned about around the world, about mistreatment, including of the worst forms of members of this community, I still believe that the symbols of hope, the symbols of leadership, the symbols of aspiration and hard work and friendship actually are the greater force here. So in a longer term sense, I am deeply hopeful. I think it's also important to note that as we travel and engage, I talk significantly about the journey that we've had in the United States, because it has not been even and it has not been quick. But I think it has shown us that the one element of the capacity to see change is the ability to speak openly, to speak personally, and to demonstrate that at the end of the day, we're talking about an issue that is essentially, quintessentially human. And I think, for those of you in the media, I think this is an especially important note that I would make, is that I think at the end of the day, whenever we have conversations where we have a significant obstacle of lack of knowledge, is in the media, you have a significant role to play in terms of reporting sensitively, reporting in a way that accurately portrays the human aspect of this, because we should never forget for a moment that the issues that we are talking about fundamentally are linked to a human being on the other end. And really that we're talking about fundamental issues of equality based on a completely immutable, unchangeable part of a person's identity. That we must begin to understand that discrimination and violence against members of the LGBTI community is no different fundamentally than discrimination and violence based on race, based on ethnicity, or based on gender. These are all expressions of the human condition, and there is great variety around the world. But the more that we understand that reality, the more I believe we will be able to accommodate and realize true equality. Of course, we have a long way to go. We've had, I think, extraordinary steps forward in the U.S. in these last few years, but that only came about after decades of quiet activism in a very difficult environment. So I have an understanding that we are talking about a process that is underway, and that there's an educational aspect of this that is extraordinarily important, because if we are going to really engage in a conversation that is based in the reality that we know to be true, that this is not, these are not expressions of identity that are chosen or voluntary, but merely expressions of how a person is born, I think then it allows us that greater ability to express compassion. I think what we have seen also from my travels is that in a global sense, whether from the government perspective, from the societal perspective, or even from the business perspective, is that we understand that we grow stronger through an embrace of that which could potentially divide us. That once we realize how significant the embrace of diversity can be for the strength of our societies, it doesn't just lift up the members of the LGBTI community, it lifts us all up. Once we understand that we are that equality and dignity under the law in any country is such a fundamental part of who we are as human beings. So I think that there is great opportunity there. I engage frequently with businesses to talk about this particular aspect, because what we also know to be true is that from a business perspective, whether those are U.S. multinational corporations, other European multinational corporations operating from Latin America, is this wide breadth of companies, before governments got around to this, understood that embracing diversity, while it is the right thing to do, is also a profitable thing to do, and it also enhances the integrity of one's business. So what we see in a number of places around the world is the business community now engaging, because to them this is not a political issue. This is an issue of retention of best talent, of being able to recruit and keep the people who can advance your business in the most effective way. And for those companies who have to send their staff all around the world, I think it's quite a hindrance to investment to wonder whether or not they can send a senior LGBT employee to a particular country because the laws don't permit it. I think that we are better than that, and I think we have a ways to go. So that's just a general comment on our global exposure, our global approach. Of course, here we've had some very, very productive meetings here in Ukraine in this very significant week leading up to the Equality March next week. I have had really extraordinary meetings with leaders in civil society here, with march planners, with representatives of the police, with city administration officials. I'll be meeting also later today with representatives of the business community and also members of the Rada to have these basic conversations. And I will tell you that my main takeaway is again, and very consistent with what I'm seeing globally, is an expression of hope that I think, understanding from our perspective that civil society leads the charge in terms of helping along with this education. I find a very resourceful, very hopeful, very motivated civil society that understand that there are challenges out there, but that if we don't begin this conversation, then nothing ever fundamentally changes. I've had the chance to see really impressive leadership from members of the Rada, and heard about that from representatives of civil society. And I've had very, very productive conversations, as I noted, with representatives of the city and the police to show that there's a real commitment there to protecting the rights and freedoms of assembly and expression of all Ukrainians. All Ukrainians. So I might just mention that I am at the conclusion of I will be departing soon to go back to the United States. I'm at the conclusion of a 3-country trip in this regard that began in Ottawa, Canada last week. It took me to northern Italy for a meeting with Italian officials and NGO representatives at a transgender meeting there, and until I came to Ukraine over the weekend. So I'll conclude my opening statement there, and certainly say that I'm quite happy to take any questions you might have.
Thank you, Mayor Barry. Mr. Barry, I have a question for you, actually. Kremlin propaganda has been using the topic of homosexuality as a very convenient tool for their propaganda. They even coined a special term, which is called Gay Europe, Gay Europa in Russian, and they use it for domestic audience. They also use it in sort of neighboring countries, quite a great deal. How would you comment on that? And do you think that the Equality March in Kiev this coming Sunday can actually further feed into that propaganda? And we of course, I hope everything goes well, but I would expect Russian operatives to be here on the ground and maybe doing something more and organizing some provocations in order to demonstrate that Ukraine is a Nazi fascist junta and look what they are doing. I mean, in different ways. Yeah. So they can use it twice. Firstly, to say, you see this, State Department is bringing, this all they care about, and then doing something nasty.
No, happy to comment on that. But I'm going to take that in a slightly broader, expansive sort of way. That certainly, I think it is a phenomenon in Russia, but is a phenomenon in many other places, to simply seize upon what I think are broad levels of misinformation and misunderstanding in the general population to gin up political support for other agendas. We see that happen in many other countries around the world. And I think that's regrettable, because at the end of the day, I don't actually think this is about LGBTI issues. It's simply about seizing upon an issue that is easily manipulated, where, again, because of the lack of information, people's opinions are easily influenced, and making it into an issue that somehow takes on civilizational or deeply, fundamentally disturbing tones. Which I think is really a pity, because I don't think it's about that at all. That really, this is a pretty reasonable stance that we're talking about. We're talking about why people shouldn't be subjected to violence because of an aspect of their identity at the end of the day. That can be misinterpreted and again taken in many contexts. A word about the march, and just more broadly about these public expressions, is that I think these are fundamentally important opportunities for people not to live in the shadows. And can these expressions be misappropriated or misinterpreted by any actor, whether that's a state actor, as in the case of Russia or others? Sure, it can. But I don't think that robs the fundamental importance of people being able simply to stand up and say, we are also here, we are citizens of this country, and all we're asking for is an equal stance. I think that's been the same in any country that I've visited. But the reality is, I tend to focus on some of these pride expressions as they occur around the world, and I think they're fundamentally important. I think fundamentally more important is what happens the other 364 days of the year. But I think these expressions can open the door to a conversation that might not otherwise be possible, and that allows the work the remainder of the year to continue. So, and I am very, very hopeful. I had good discussions with the police and with city officials. I think public messaging has been commendable in every way, and I certainly hope for a very peaceful expression of this freedom.
We have another question here.
Good morning, Christina Shelmakina, Ukraine Crisis Media Center. Recently we have seen on Facebook a public statement from one of the police officials who's responsible for fighting drug crimes here in Ukraine, that he's against homosexuals. However, police is in charge of protecting the Kiev Pride that will happen soon. So my question is, how should Ukraine tolerate government officials who are currently not tolerant towards LGBT rights? Should we fire them because they're LGBT intolerant, or should we keep them?
Yeah. Well, the statement that I look for from the police that is definitive is from the chief of police here in Ukraine. Has very, very clearly stated what the police force's professional response and stance is going to be. We've gone through a similar set of situations in the U.S. where people who are in public service actually express a dissenting private view, and I think that's fine. I mean, that this ultimately isn't about enforcing a person's belief. People are free to believe whatever they want, but at least the journey that we found in the States is that there's a very clear separation between believing what one wants and the conduct of one's professional duties, and I think that there's a clear definition there. Ukraine is a secular state, just as the United States is, but I don't mean to suggest this is easy, because this has been very, very recent in the States that we've had this similar discussion over this. But I think very clearly the jurisprudence is, again, a fundamental respect for a person's right to believe what they want, simply not to do what they want, especially when they are charged with in a position of public trust, where their job is to do something that is clearly defined by the needs of the state. Thank you.
Chris Miller, Radio Free Europe. Mr. Barry, I'm wondering, in your meetings with government officials, if you can tell us exactly who you met with, how your message to them was received. I'm wondering specifically if you've met with Mayor Klitschko and other representatives from the Interior Ministry, possibly Bankova. They have in the past been very slow to evolve on the LGBT issue and have refrained from speaking publicly about it or coming out in support of it. I'm wondering if you encourage them to do so, and if you would expect any statement of that sort ahead of the Equality March this weekend. Mm-hmm.
Well, for statements, I think clearly there have already been a couple of public statements from folks that we met with. I met with the head of the National Police, and I met with the city administration officials. I understand Mayor Klitschko is still traveling, but in fact, Well, I don't want to go into all the details of those meetings. I can tell you that the message that we received privately matches very significantly with those statements that have been issued in a public sense. And I think especially with our conversations with civil society folks as well, that there are a couple of aspects that are very important here, clearly, and one is the planning, the logistical planning for an event such as this, but the other is the public messaging, and I think there's a clear understanding of that. But for plans for additional public statement, I would refer you back to those entities.
Якщо більше немає питань, то I would like to thank you, Mr. Berry, and for taking the time to come here. And we're happy that you made that trip to Ukraine, and wish you a smooth flight back home.
Thank you very much. My
Thank you.
pleasure. Thank you.